Hi everyone, my name is Kayla Tullis and I'm a doctoral candidate at Baylor University. Today I will present my research study, Understanding Experiences of Creating Community in School for LGBTQ+ Students, a qualitative instrumental case study. This research was conducted under the guidance of Dr. Sarah Pratt. Today I'm going to lead you through 9 agenda items: the statement of the problem, literature review, purpose statement, research questions, theoretical framework, methodology, overview of findings, implications and recommendations, and the distribution plan. Statement of the problem. The problem is that victimization negatively impacts LGBTQ+ students' mental health, exacerbating feelings of isolation by the subsequent inability to find community among their peers. In this table, you can see data that supports this problem. 27% of LGBTQ+ students have experienced physical harassment due to their sexual orientation and gender expression. 71% have experienced verbal harassment. 89% have experienced at least one type of victimization. 7% experienced victimization due to their sexual orientation, and 60% experienced victimization due to their gender expression. Next is the literature review. My literature review consists of 6 sections. The first section is Understanding of Sexuality and Gender Identity. This section gives a baseline understanding of what sexuality and gender identity is. The second section is Development of Sense of Identity. This study focuses on LGBTQ+ students in grades 7 to 10, and in these moments of their life, they are having a big moment in developing their sense of identity. So this section explores that process. The third section is LGBTQ+ laws and rights, and this section gives an overview of the progression of LGBTQ+ laws and rights and how far we have come and also how far we still have to go. The fourth section is intersectionality, which is understanding that each person and each LGBTQ students has multiple identities, and it is important that we understand how all of their identities impact how they experience the world. The fifth section is hostile and anti-LGBTQ+ school climate, and this section reviews how LGBTQ+ students experience a hostile and LGBTQ+ school climate. And the last section, the sixth section, inclusion and support for LGBTQ+ students. And this section explores how inclusion and support for LGBTQ+ students is important, and also, in a way, how it is lacking as well. The purpose of this qualitative instrumental case study is to understand the lived experiences of Baltimore City LGBTQ+ students when developing a community in school. There are 2 research questions for this study. The first is, what experiences do LGBTQ+ students have in developing communities in school? And the second is, how do LGBTQ+ students describe their experiences with proximal and distal stresses in their community? To guide my study, I used the Minority Stress Framework by Ian Meyer. There are 5 theoretical framework components that were focused on in this study. Those are distal stress processes, proximal stress processes, characteristics of minority identity, coping and social support, and mental health outcomes. Myers says that when minority identities and values diverge from those of socially dominant groups, those different values can adversely affect how minority members perceive their social environments. And the framework also states that minority stressors like stigma, prejudice, and discrimination that are socially based, ongoing, and specific to that stigmatized group can contribute to a hostile environment that negatively affects a person's mental health. This study was a qualitative instrumental case study that focused on the phenomenon of LGBTQ+ students' experiences in creating community in school. There were 6 participants in this study that had to meet 3 specific selection criteria. The first, being a member of the LGBTQ+ community. Second, being in grades 7 to 10 or had graduated high school within the past 2 years. And third, a current student or had graduated from Baltimore City Public Schools. There were 6 participants in total, 4 in grades 7 to 10, and 2 that had graduated within 2 years. The participants had a choice between a semi-structured interview or an anonymous questionnaire. 2 chose a semi-structured interview, and 4 chose the anonymous questionnaire. Next, I will discuss an overview of my study's findings. As I analyzed the data from the interviews and the questionnaire responses, I identified 3 themes. Over the next few screens, you will see that it is broken down by second cycle coding, categories, and then themes. The second cycle codes are patterns I identified from the data. That was then put into categories, and then from those categories, I identified themes. The first theme that was found was that LGBTQ plus students were experiencing marginalization and mistreatment. And those initial second cycle codes were marginalization and lack of community, which is then put into the category of marginalization. And then the theme that was found was that LGBTQ plus students experience marginalization and mistreatment while trying to create community in their school. The second theme is isolation and exclusion of LGBTQ plus students. When analyzing the data, it came up that a lot of the students felt socially isolated, and that heteronormative ideas and values very much made them feel excluded and isolated, and that they felt social exclusion in school, and that because of that, they also had a lack of community. And that was bundled into the categories of isolation and exclusion, which then got us to our second theme of LGBTQ plus students feeling isolated and excluded in school. The third theme, psychological impact, is split into 2 categories, which are positive and negative psychological impact, which you will see on the following 2 slides. The first we'll talk about are the negative psychological impacts for LGBTQ plus students when creating community in school. So for the second cycle codes, we have a few codes, which were expectation of stigmatization, the anticipation of backlash from students at school, the fear of stigma from students, struggling with their own self-acceptance and who they are, and because of that, experiencing psychological distress and the mental health impact that had, which then for most led to having depression and anxiety. And all of these are negative impacts that LGBTQ plus students faced when creating community in school. Now, the second category that is related to psychological impact, which are the positive mental health impacts, those second cycle codes are learning to cope. Some actually had positive experiences in learning to accept themselves and experiencing and creating a resilient mindset when having to deal with creating community in school, being and learning to be their authentic selves, finding safe spaces for themselves in school, and being vulnerable not just with themselves but also other classmates. And that ended up accumulating into a positive psychological impacts for LGBTQ plus students when creating community in school. Connections to literature. My findings did connect back and align with the literature. The first finding, mistreatment and marginalization, aligned with literature related to students' disclosure of identity, consistent experience of name-calling, and dismissal of feelings from teachers. For example, Kazov conducted a study that focused on how an LGBTQ plus student being visible could result in them being victimized in school. And they did find that students who were out to their peers were at a higher risk for victimization and mistreatment. The second finding, isolation and exclusion, aligned with literature related to hostile school climate and feelings of isolation and exclusion due to their identity. For example, Harris and his colleagues researched how schools can actually unknowingly contribute to LGBTQ plus students' feelings of isolation, and they found that a majority of students felt excluded despite of the creation of what schools considered a safe space. And some students said it actually contributed more to their feelings of isolation and exclusion. And I think it's important to point out what the safe space that was created was based on what the school's perceived notion of what a safe space is and not actually what the students needed. And in that way, it contributed more to their feelings of isolation and exclusion. And lastly, the last finding, psychological impact related to literature regarding students feeling as though they're being treated as though they have a mental illness, feelings of unworthiness, and depression and anxiety. Heck and his colleagues conducted a research study that focused on the role school victimization LGBTQ plus students faced and its impact it had on their feelings of school belonging and also how it impacted their mental health. And they found that school victimization is a factor and could help explain why LGBTQ plus youth report lower levels of school belonging and higher levels of depression and psychological distress relative to their heterosexual peers. I made implications and recommendations for two key decision makers that have a direct impact on how LGBTQ plus students experience school. First, teachers must recognize their role in creating a safe space for LGBTQ plus students in school. They will benefit from these findings by understanding LGBTQ plus experiences socially interacting in school. And I recommend that they increase their awareness of interpersonal dynamics within their classroom, become vigilant to their student interactions, and recognize signs of withdrawal and feelings of exclusion or isolation when it comes to the LGBTQ plus students, and strive to create a safe space for the LGBTQ plus students, not just necessarily in their classroom, but overall in the school. Second, school administrators help create the foundation of the school climate. School administrators need to use their significant influence to create a safe schooling environment through their actions, policy, and messaging. I recommend that school administrators create and enact protective policies for LGBTQ plus students, and that they create and implement LGBTQ plus representation in the school curriculum. My distribution plan for reaching teachers is to connect with the LGBTQ plus community members who are Baltimore City public school teachers, and also use those connections that I make with finding those community members and present findings to the Baltimore City Teachers Union. The Baltimore City Teachers Union is very active and has a big influence on Baltimore City public schools. My distribution plan for school administrators is to attend the Baltimore City Board of Education public meeting to talk about and present my findings, and use that initial meeting as leverage to pave the way to disseminate findings to the larger public school community. And here are my references. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and view my study.